everyone, and welcome to Let's Text About It, a NAMI Talks podcast hosted by NAMI Maine's Teen Tech Support Line team. This podcast highlights the voices of young adults who work on the text line and support youth with mental health challenges. In each episode, we'll delve into the world of peer support, sharing firsthand experiences, insights, and resources to navigate life's challenges. This podcast may address sensitive topics like suicide or self-harm. Please look out for your mental well-being and seek support as needed. The teen text line is open from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. Monday through Friday and 12 p.m. to 10 p.m. on Saturday and Sunday. The line can be reached at 207-515-8398 and is meant for people ages 13 to 23 who are looking for mental health support but are not experiencing a mental health crisis. I'm Grace, and today I'm joined by Dennis and Sarah to discuss self-care. So what is self-care? The term self-care has been popularized in the media and in branding. Influencers, celebrities, and companies often utilize the term to help sell products like skincare and candles. While those things are wonderful for self-care, the idea of self-care goes beyond what we might see advertised today. The notion of self-care has deep roots in both the medical field and social movements like the civil rights movement. Medically, self-care was a way for patients to treat themselves and exercise healthy habits, most often under the guidance of a health professional. Additionally, self-care was introduced as a way for people in emotionally strenuous jobs to combat the stress of their careers by taking care of themselves. Socially, self-care can be traced back to the civil rights movement and activists like Audre Lorde, who moved the definition of self-care beyond the treatment of an individual and toward a more systemic idea that recognized intersectionality. To Lorde, who wrote about self-care in her book A Burst of Light, self-care was an act of self-preservation that sustained her ability to forge the change she wanted to see in the world. As many ways as there are to define self-care are ways to practice it. An all-encompassing way that we are going to talk about today is by referencing the self-care wheel. The self-care wheel was created by Olga Phoenix, a speaker and author with a background in trauma, burnout, and resilience. To her, self-care is about learning what nourishes our body, mind, and spirit. It's about discovering what makes us feel whole and free, what gives us purpose, what makes us feel like we matter and belong. It's about a journey of becoming our own best friend. Within the self-care wheel is 6 sections: physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual, personal, and professional. As we move through the podcast today, we will touch on these different ideas. So let's get into it. Sarah and Dennis, I'm interested in learning about your self-care journey. And when did self-care become something you knew about?
I guess I can start us off. I'm Dennis. I mean, self-care has always, I think, been a part of my life, but I'm not sure if I knew it by that name until maybe a few years ago. I mean, self-care to me is just kind of um doing what I need to do for myself, but in a systematic manner. And I've been doing that for a while now, but I just recently learned about the history behind self-care and kind of all the areas that self-care can be found in. So it's kind of a growing interest of mine.
Great. And I know that you were featured on our podcast on men's mental health, but I am interested. Do you think that self-care is kind of different for young men?
Yes and no. I would think that young men are maybe more hesitant to call it by that name and say
Hmm.
self-care because there may be a little bit of a stigma around it or around kind of being associated with mental health, especially for men, but anyone. But that doesn't mean that men don't practice self-care because of course they do. I just think sometimes, yeah, they would hesitate to call it that, but it's important for everyone, I think.
That makes sense. What about you, Sarah?
Yeah, so I think like this was pretty much the first time I really heard about the history of self-care, but I think I was first introduced to it or the concept through social media, especially like more recently, it's become a very like popularized buzz term sort of, um, in a good way, of course. But I think that like I initially had that sort of idea that self-care was just like mani pedis and facials, which I think is why sometimes there might be that stigma around men and self-care, because the go-to thought is that like self-care is mani pedis and facials, but it's not necessarily that. And I think I'm sort of learning that self-care is holistic in that it's like nourishing your body, but beyond just nutrients and like your diet, also like nourishing your mind and nourishing your relationships. So yeah, there's that. And then I think from in the past few years, I've sort of transitioned, like Dennis said, to a more systemic or systematic like method of self-care, whereas before it was just sort of like spontaneous self-care. Like I feel like doing this, so I'm going to do this because that's self-care. Whereas now it's like intentional self-care, and I like have to plan it into my day and force myself to like get those relaxing nutrients, I guess, from
Yeah.
things into my daily diet or daily dose of whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think what you were talking about is exactly kind of why I wanted to do that brief introduction on the history of self-care. I think that we saw a really big uptick in talking about it during the pandemic, with people working from home, people, having to juggle, like struggling even more with like a work-life balance, and obviously just the stressors of a pandemic going on and so much uncertainty. There was a lot of discussion of self-care. But again, it did kind of become a buzzword, as you mentioned. And I do think that like having it basically about like the mani-pedis or the facials or candles or baths, and again, those are all forms of self-care, but it goes farther than that. And I do think that it can be a bit polarizing when it comes to like different gender identities, and do they resonate with those forms of self-care or do they not? So I appreciate what both of you said. For me, self-care, again, I also didn't really have like the concept of it until I started college, because as a social work major, it was a big part of every single class that I took. Social work would kind of fall under one of the more, it can be kind of a stressful field, a lot about, being there for others, caring for others, and reminding us of the importance of being there for ourselves. And so it was, there were actual like lessons on it in my classes, and we talked about the self-care wheel, and we also talked a little bit about kind of the more systematic self-care, and how like a bubble bath can't necessarily fix like a negative work environment. And so, things like self-advocacy and boundaries are self-care as well. And that goes kind of beyond like the surface level things that I think we might consider. So, moving on from that, kind of why does it matter to you? Why is this something that you take time for? Why is self-care important?
Um, I mean, for me, I think it matters a lot to me just because I've noticed the positive impact it's had on my life. Like whenever I make a like conscious change to emphasize self-care, I can tell that it kind of helps. For example, like a few years ago or like a few years back, I was not great at sleeping. Like my sleep schedule sucked. It was very inconsistent. And now it's much better just because I pretty much set a bedtime and wake up the same day, the same hour every day. And like it sounds like a simple change and it is, but it actually really helped both in my energy and sleeping and all that, but other aspects of my life. So I think for me personally, it's just seeing the actual results and the impacts of it, of a change I'm making and deciding, yeah, I'm going to keep this change because it's actually helping. And then if I don't see those impacts, I can think about, why it's not helping and what I can change about that new habit or whatever it is I'm thinking about.
Yeah, to second that, I think well, first of all, it matters to me because who doesn't want to be happy? Um,
Yeah.
but I think also it's noticing the results of having self-care in my daily routine versus not having it. Like sometimes I think I could just like go a week just working straight and I don't necessarily need it, but then at the end of that week I'll feel completely burnt out, and I realize like maybe not taking those breaks sort of hurt me in the long run. Um, but yeah, so that's why it matters. And also like heavily affects how I relationally like interact
Mhm.
with my family and my friends. Just because if I'm burnt out, I'm probably gonna take it out in my relationships or like isolate more. So it sort of fosters like self-care for me, but also for my relationships and for the bonds that I formed in my life. Um, yeah, and it's nice to be like your own caring like mother figure to yourself, having somebody like care for you, that's you caring for you. That's how that looks. It's just nice to have that in your life. And I think you mentioned like learning to become your own best friend is part of that process. Yeah.
Definitely. I agree with everything that was said. I like the saying of like you can't pour from an empty cup. A little bit cliche, but I think it's very true. And so I think that, taking time for yourself and giving yourself kind of attention and compassion, does, as you mentioned, kind of come out in your relationships, and your ability to kind of move through the world in a way that you would like to. Um, that's great. So, what are some barriers to self-care that you come up against, or maybe some that you've seen people mention on the text line?
Sarah, you can go first if you want. I don't want to be the first talker every time.
Go
Yeah,
ahead,
I'm
Sarah.
taking a no, it's fine. Um, taking a second to think about this, but barriers definitely when I'm just like in a tired, exhausted mood where it's just like, oh,
Mm.
I don't feel like doing anything. It could be easy to sort of just go to sleep or sleep it off, which is like the go-to sort of self-care. But then at other times, I know that like I need to get out of bed and sort of force myself to like move and exercise and do what I don't necessarily want to do in that moment. But I know in the long term, like that's sort of what my body and what I need. Um, so I think that's a barrier because it's like, is this really self-care if I'm forcing myself to do this and I don't
Mhm.
want to, but I know that it's going to help me? There's sort of like a bit of confusion there and a bit of like I don't know, a bit of a barrier. But on the line, I'm trying to think. I think I've seen that too, where it's just like I just don't feel like doing that right now, or that doesn't sound appealing and that doesn't sound fun. Um, and I think in those cases, we usually work with the texter and see like what does look like fun right now, what emotional need needs to be met at this moment, and how can you meet that through self-care. So I think you mentioned like um being more assertive and setting boundaries, that's a form of self-care, and maybe that's what they need to do. So it doesn't necessarily need to be like go for a jog, it could be like setting a boundary. But yeah, sort of exploring what self-care is needed in the moment, um short term or long term. Yeah, I don't know if that answered the
Yeah,
question.
absolutely. I think that a barrier that I know for myself, and I think what a lot of people come up against is time. Like a lot of people we talk to, if they're like students and they have after school activities and this and that, finding the time to engage in a self-care activity, that can be a big issue. And then also when we kind of go back to some of the self-care ideas like the mani-pedi or like a bubble bath or this and that, being able to afford that, being able to take the time for that. And also like it very much is a privilege to be able to pause and focus on yourself and take care of yourself. Not everyone, as I mentioned, like has the time or the capacity. Maybe they have to care for others. And so I think that that may be a barrier for some people.
Yeah, I
Anything to add,
definitely agree
Dennis?
with, yeah, I definitely agree with everything you guys just said. Just echoing a few points. I think for me personally, the biggest barrier is probably time. And like what by that I mean like not really prioritizing self-care so that it always is the last thing on my list kind of.
Mm.
Which I think is true for a lot of people. Like, you do your homework before watching a movie or whatever. But I think that's part of the reason why it's really important to be structured and like deliberate with your self-care and not just be
Mm.
like, oh, if I literally have nothing to do, I'll do self-care. But plan ahead, just like you'd plan out when you're going to do your assignments, set aside time to do whatever it is you need to do, go to the gym or spend time with your friends or whatever. Like you need to set aside time for that. Otherwise, if you're not prioritizing it, or if you're prioritizing other things above it, you'll just never get to it.
Yeah.
And another thing, I think it was Sarah mentioned, like as an example, setting boundaries as a self-care act can be like kind of uncomfortable, but it's almost the long-term impacts that like, benefit you. Um, so yeah, self-care being uncomfortable or difficult in the moment, I think is a boundary, but just having that confidence that it's going to help in the long run.
Yeah. Also, I want to second something that you said, Grace. I think, and both of you actually pointed out like the time barrier. And I think both of that, like what you guys said, goes back to like socioeconomic barriers that we often talk about in the context of like medical access and access to medical care or whatever. But
Mm-hmm.
we don't really recognize that self-care is a form of healthcare and medicine. So it's like we can have those barriers to self-care as well. So I think just recognizing that that's a barrier, um, in a way is a form of self-care because it's like, okay, my life, like it's really difficult, but I can work through it, Yeah. Anyways.
100%. I think that's a really great point. Um, so with that, I'm curious, kind of what do you all, kind of do for self-care and then utilizing the self-care wheel, sort of what areas do you think you are kind of strongest in and what areas do you think you'd want to work on? And I can start. I think I'm pretty strong like with psychological self-care. I do things like that or journaling. I like to draw, I like to paint, kind of things that help quiet my mind and ease my mind. Um, I think also I think that, let's see, I think personal self-care I'm pretty good with as well. Kind of doing things that I enjoy. I also, a part of that is like kind of learning who I am, kind of figuring out what I want, making a vision board. I make a vision board at the beginning of each new year. And so I feel like kind of learning myself, I really try and take the time to do. And then one that I would like to practice more, or a couple of them, physical. I think that I really like swimming, I really like walking, but that's something that I often feel like I don't take the time for, even if I have it. Like, I would rather maybe just like scroll on social media or something. And so that's definitely an area I want to work more on, as well as spiritual. I took a couple spiritually kind of related or adjacent courses in college, and I got really into it and really enjoyed it. But as I graduated and that wasn't as accessible to me, I've kind of moved away from some of the practices I had. So I'd like to get back into meditation and things like that. Um, so yeah, just kind of taking a look at this. Obviously, listeners can't hear it, but as a reminder, the sections are professional, physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual, and personal. Um,
Yeah, for me personally, I think the like areas of self-care that I'm good at are the ones that I kind of started good at, like I'm good at naturally still. And I think
mm,
that's personal, like including setting aside time for social relationships and working on myself, and also physical, just because I've always kind of had a habit of being active, and also professional. Like those three, I think kind of come natural to me just because I've been doing them for so long almost.
yeah.
On the flip side, I think spiritual and emotional are a little bit of my weaker ones, or ones that I have to kind of be more conscious about, or like
Mm,
deliberately set aside time for, just because, like I said, it's not something that I naturally or just, as myself think about or set aside time for. So I think those are the ones that I definitely want to work on, like setting aside time to think about the emotional side of things, or do some spiritual activities, things like that.
yeah, absolutely. What about you, Sarah?
Yeah, I'm with you guys. I think I struggle with, let's actually, okay, I think I have a pretty easy time with psychological and emotional, and personal. Spiritual, I feel like I don't really gravitate towards like a single spiritual identity. So for me, that's
Mm,
not as like structured into my
yeah.
daily life. Um, so I think maybe that would be something I want to focus more on just because it sort of ebbs and flows when I practice that sort of self-care. Um, I think the one that I really need to work on is professional, especially now that I'm like considered a young adult where it's like I'm moving into the workforce that the
Mm.
rest of the population, like the adults are in. Um,
Mhm.
but so it's like setting those boundaries with more authoritative figures is kind of it's always scary, but it's even more scary when it's like now it's your boss and you don't know what's gonna happen. And I think it's just a new like area to sort of get my feel for and practice being in and practice setting those boundaries. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree. That's one that can be really hard, especially as you mentioned, like new to the workforce, like just after graduating, like the desire to kind of like do the most that you can, like all the time, and then feeling like you're letting someone down if you don't. And so being able to like some things on the list there were like actually like taking your lunch break and like not working overtime, like all those things. And again, that's where I think we get back into self-care being more than just individual, but also social and systemic. Because if you have a boss that responds negatively to you trying to take like a lunch break, then it's like, okay, well then, I can't do that. I can't lose my job. So I guess I'm just gonna eat during work. And so it's like there's so much more to it than just the individual responsibility. Um, and that's something that was kind of also taught in one of my classes that really stuck with me, is that it's like there's only so much we can do as people, and sometimes we are going to come up against circumstances that work counter to the ways that we're trying to care for ourselves. And so how do we navigate that situation, because we can't always abandon it, right? You can't just like be like, okay, well, sorry, like I'm taking my lunch and up and leave. You can try and maybe it'll work, but that's hard. That's really hard. And I think also self-care in the classroom can be really hard. If you need like a bathroom break or a water break, there's so much structure within school that it seems like maybe you kind of lose some of that independence during your day to day. If you're anxious in class, you get a phone call, it can be hard to feel like you don't have necessarily like all control over what you're doing. Um, and so again, just, practicing some affirmations, practicing boundaries, things like that, are important. So something that, moving on to the next question, something that I've seen on the text line is people maybe saying that they aren't worthy of caring for themselves, or that they don't believe that self-care will help them. And so kind of like, have you ever believed that like you weren't worthy of self-care? Maybe you didn't like deserve those boundaries. You didn't deserve to rest or things like that. Have you ever kind of been in that mindset before?
I think I definitely have. The example that came to mind for me when you posed this question was like a lot of times I feel like this is pretty common. You say you're gonna be productive in some way, then you say you're gonna take some sort of break, like, oh, I said this earlier, but I'm gonna do my homework, then watch a movie. But then
Yeah.
if you don't get around to the homework part, you always feel bad watching the movie. Like that, I think that happens to me a lot. But like I said earlier, so like yes, I've definitely felt that way, but I think that's where the structure of self-care comes in and the discipline of it, because
Mm,
like if you don't watch that movie or do whatever you need to do for self-care, like that's not going to make you any more productive the next day. Like you need to find that balance and recognize that like self-care plays a role in productivity or and vice versa. So you need to like you do deserve it and you also need it. So that's kind of how I legitimize my self-care when I'm feeling that I don't deserve it.
yeah, absolutely. That's a really great example.
Yeah, just going off that, I think it's important to remember that we can't really beat ourselves up to get better. Like that doesn't really help us
Mm,
get better if we're just beating ourselves up. It's sort of like going back to like the mother analogy, like if you are taking care of a child, you don't like punish them necessarily because they didn't do something right. If especially if you want them to grow. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, also going back to like this, that's where sort of the discipline comes in with self-care. That could be really important in that case. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there have definitely been times where I've like been quite down on myself. Um, and just I don't know, it's an odd feeling just thinking like, it's weird to say like, oh, I don't deserve to feel well or something. But kind of your example, Dennis, I resonate with a lot, especially when I was in school and with gonna be returning to school this fall. I'm gonna need to remind myself that exactly what you were saying of like I am no more or less worthy of taking care of myself, based on how productive I've been. And I think that that is something that is really hard for me. Um, so yeah, and I love what you said, Sarah, and I think it's kind of getting at the like you can't like hate yourself into loving yourself kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I mean, I think that that's exactly it. Like hopefully the more that you practice small acts of self-care, even if it's just like one thing a day for like a minute, like I am going to, I don't know, say an affirmation for a minute, that sort of thing of I think the more compassion you can have for yourself, the easier these things will become. And so I think that brings us nicely to wrapping this up. How can self-care become sustainable and kind of part of a balanced like personal treatment plan?
Uh, I can start us off.
Yeah,
For
please do.
me, when I started getting into like a balanced sort of plan, I paired it with something I did every night. So something I do every night is brushing my teeth. So it would just start with something super simple, like saying affirmations while I brush my teeth. So start simple. Don't like rush yourself into getting like every single form of self-care in one day. Just take it one day at a time, one thing per day. And then like slowly, when it becomes easier, you can add more. Yeah, that would be my advice.
Yeah, I
Yeah, I
definitely
love
agree with
that.
that. I would also say, yeah, kind of like we were saying about adding more as you go. I mean, personally, I'm sure I'm not alone for this. I don't really reference the self-care wheel every day or anything. Like I kind of just have my daily routine. But I think something like that can be a useful tool of like assessing, maybe even like every 6 months or something, or every year, like, wow, I am really kind of neglecting social or physical or something. Like kind of just assessing your daily routine. Because I don't think anyone really thinks critically about what they're doing every single day. You kind of get into a routine, but taking that time to just plan out, and if you need to make any changes, like improve on your like current kind of self-care routine, that would be my advice.
Yeah, I like that. Sarah, like what you mentioned about like picking something that you already do every day, and adding some element of kind of self-care to it. I mean, brushing your teeth is self-care, but like even adding like the affirmations, that's like another level of it. And I think that that's really smart. And when I was going through a really hard time, I decided to do a gratitude list every night before I went to bed, like 10 items that or like 10 things that I was grateful for that day. And I found that really helpful, because it reminded me that like, even if, life was going really, really like even if things were really challenging, at the end of the day, I still had like these 10 things that I was grateful for and that weren't gonna like leave, they were going to stay. Um, and so I completely agree, starting small. And Dennis, I like what you said about kind of like reevaluating like halfway through the year or maybe even like halfway through the month. Of like kind of what areas am I kind of feeling good in and what areas am I feel like I'm lacking. I think that that is a really great practice. And again, as you have both mentioned, and as I just said, like this is a practice, and it does require discipline. It requires effort, and it's almost, as one of you mentioned earlier, it's a little bit counterintuitive of like having to put energy into doing something that's meant to like give you energy. But I think that as time goes on, it can become a bit more natural. Um, And yeah, I just remind myself, like, at the end of the day, like, I have to live with myself for the rest of my life. And so I'd like to try and treat myself as kindly as possible. Um, so yeah, that wraps us up for today. So thank you, Sarah and Dennis, for joining me. That's all for this episode of Let's Text About It. Make sure to subscribe to NAMI Talks wherever you get your podcasts. And if you liked this episode, make sure to like and share. Thank you for listening, and we hope you tune in to our next episode.